Evelyn stood at the threshold of her small, cozy apartment in the city, taking one final look at the place she had called home for the past few years. The air felt thick with the weight of goodbye, even though she had only lived there a short time. The walls, once filled with memories of late nights and quiet mornings, now stood silent. She had already packed her bags, ready to leave behind the mundane life she had grown used to. There was only one thing left to do: go to the manor. It had been weeks since Evelyn received the strange letter that summoned her to Evermore Manor, a place shrouded in mystery and dark whispers. She had felt an unsettling pull ever since, the kind of pull that reaches into the very marrow of your bones and gnaws at your insides. But something about it intrigued her, something beyond the wealth or the inheritance she'd been told she could claim. There was a certain allure to it, like a thread pulling her towards something she couldn't name. She had no choice, or so she thought. The inheritance was hers by blood, a distant relative she'd never met, and yet their death had created this strange opening in her life. She hadn't even known the manor existed until now. It felt as though the world was guiding her toward this moment. Just as she grabbed the handle of her suitcase and turned to leave, the mail slot clinked. She froze for a moment, the sudden sound of something arriving in her life, jolting her out of her reverie. Her gaze drifted toward the small pile of letters on the floor. Among the usual bills and advertisements, one envelope stood out. It was thick, the paper a rich shade of cream, with no return address. Just a name scribbled in elegant script: Evelyn Albright. She hesitated. A second letter. The letter seemed to hum with an energy that made her skin prickle. She bent down and retrieved it, feeling an odd coolness in her fingertips as they brushed the edges. The ink was old-fashioned, the words elegant, yet there was something strange about the way they seemed to swirl on the page. She tore it open, half expecting it to be a mistake, but when she began to read, the words twisted in her mind. To Evelyn Albright, beware, for Evermore Manor is not as it seems. Once you enter, you will never leave. The house claims those it desires, and its hunger is eternal. The path you walk has been set in motion long before you arrived. I warn you, if you seek to leave, you will find the doors have been sealed shut. Those who enter are lost forever, wandering the halls as shadows of themselves. You have been chosen, but not as the heir you think you are. Do not go. Her heart pounded, the ink of the letter blurring in her mind. The warning was so ominous, too specific, as though the writer knew exactly what she was about to do. A shiver crawled up her spine, but the lingering temptation of the manor's mysteries tugged her forward. She couldn't explain it, but there was something about the letter, something that felt true, absurd, she whispered aloud, though her voice trembled. She folded the letter and stuffed it into her coat pocket, a strange tightness in her chest. She looked around at her apartment one last time. The idea of turning back now felt preposterous. It had already begun. She couldn't stop it, not now. With a deep breath, Evelyn squared her shoulders. Evermore Manor. The journey to the manor felt longer than it should have. She had studied maps and directions for days, certain she knew the way. Yet, as her car hummed down the empty road, the landscape began to feel different. The air grew heavier, as if the very atmosphere was thickening, suffocating her. The trees, at first distant, harmless, began to crowd the road. Their trunks seemed unnaturally tall and dark, their branches twisting and reaching like long gnarled fingers. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the path. But as she continued, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She glanced at her rearview mirror. The road behind her was gone, replaced by dense forest, as though the landscape itself had shifted while she wasn't looking. Her heart skipped. Hadn't she just passed that same stretch of road a moment ago? Her tires crunched over the gravel, and the car seemed to slow on its own, as if it too sensed the danger creeping into the air. The trees seemed to close in around her. Each bend she took led her deeper into an unfamiliar stretch of land, the road twisting and narrowing like a serpent coiling around her. The thought crossed her mind. Was she being guided? The trees, now unnaturally dark and oppressive, pressed in closer. The shadows felt darker, deeper, as though they were alive and watching her. The feeling of being watched grew so overwhelming that Evelyn's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. She could have sworn that the trees were leaning in toward the car, their branches moving of their own accord, the thick trunks bending as though whispering something to one another. The temperature in the car dropped, and she shivered, her breath becoming visible in the cold air. The road curved sharply, and before her, the manor appeared, its massive silhouette looming at the top of the hill, like an old beast rising from the ground. She had expected grandeur, maybe even something grandiose, but instead, it felt like she had driven into another world entirely, one that was at once strangely familiar and deeply unsettling. As the car ascended the hill, Evelyn noticed something else, something inexplicable. The trees had stopped moving. The road no longer felt like it belonged to this world. It was as though the road itself had shifted to direct her to Evermore Manor, as though the land had been waiting for her arrival. She wasn't just going to the manor was calling her. Evelyn shivered again, this time with more than just cold. Her eyes locked on the manor's outline, silent, looming, and waiting. She couldn't shake the eerie sensation that something was wrong, but she had come this far. She had no choice but to continue. The manor was waiting. The car's tires crunched to a halt as Evelyn arrived at the front gates of Evermore Manor. Her breath caught as she looked up at the looming structure, a mansion that seemed to grow out of the very earth, as if it had always been there, waiting for her arrival. Its jagged silhouette was softened only by the darkening twilight sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the manicured grounds. For a moment, Evelyn felt her pulse quicken. She could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, as though it was aware of her, watching her even before she stepped inside. But she shook the feeling off. She was here for answers, for her inheritance, for closure. She had no time for superstition. The front door of the manor opened slowly as she approached, revealing a tall, slender man standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his features sharp and calculating. His eyes, a dull shade of gray, seemed to pierce through her, though his expression remained neutral, almost too neutral. "Miss Albright," he said, his voice deep but smooth, like polished wood. "Welcome to Evermore Manor. I am Mr. Griffith, your guide. Please, come inside." Evelyn nodded, offering a thin smile, and stepped inside the grand foyer. The door creaked shut behind her, with an ominous finality, and the air felt cooler, heavier. The walls of the manor were adorned with old tapestries and faded portraits, their eyes seeming to follow her every move. The scent of dust and aged wood hung in the air, and the silence was thick, almost oppressive. As Mr. Griffith led her through the long hallways, explaining the manor's history and her inheritance, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every room they passed seemed to have an air of abandonment, though the place was clearly well maintained, There was an unsettling stillness to everything, as though time itself had frozen here, trapped within these walls. "Here we are," Mr. Griffith said, stopping in front of a large wooden door at the end of the hallway. "Your quarters for the duration of your stay, Miss Albright." Evelyn looked at the door, its intricate carvings worn from centuries of use. It looked as though it had not been opened in years. She felt a shiver run down her spine as she stepped inside.
The room was spacious, with heavy velvet curtains drawn tight over the windows. The furnishings were ornate, though time had not been kind to them. Dust lingered in the corners, and the air had a faint, musty odor. The room felt abandoned, like a forgotten relic of the past. "Thank you, Mr. Griffith," she said, trying to sound casual, though the tightness in her chest betrayed her unease. "Of course," Mr. Griffith replied, his voice colder now. "If you need anything, just ring the bell." And with that, he left her standing alone in the dim light of the room. As the minutes ticked by, Evelyn's curiosity gnawed at her. She couldn't stay confined to her room all night. The manor had a strange energy that seemed to pull at her, calling her to explore. She had to know more about this place, the legacy that awaited her, and why she felt as if she was being drawn into something beyond her understanding. She stepped into the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet beneath her feet. The manor stretched out in every direction, a labyrinth of rooms and hallways. As she wandered through the quiet corridors, she found herself standing before a door she hadn't noticed before, tucked away at the end of a narrow passage. The wood was old and weathered, its surface etched with intricate symbols and markings she couldn't decipher. Her hand hesitated just before touching the doorknob, but something inside her urged her forward. It was as if the house itself was inviting her to open it. She turned the knob slowly, the door creaking on its hinges, and stepped inside. The room was dim, the only light coming from a flickering candle on a nearby table. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old, dusty books and trinkets that seemed to belong to another time. But what caught her eye was the large, gilded portrait hanging on the far wall. It was an old family portrait, though the faces had been deliberately scratched out, erased, leaving only the outline of the figures. The image was haunting, as though the faces had been torn away not by time, but by intent. The scratched faces seemed to mock her, their absence screaming louder than any image could. Evelyn stepped closer, drawn to the eerie artwork. She could almost feel the weight of the eyes that had once been there, staring at her from the canvas. As she reached out to touch the frame, a sudden soft voice cut through the air, distinctly different from the whisper she had heard earlier in the manor. "You should never have come." Evelyn froze, her blood running cold. The voice wasn't coming from anyone in the room. It felt like it had come from the walls themselves, as if the house was speaking to her. Her heart pounded in her chest, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The air grew heavy, thick with a presence she couldn't see but could feel. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, stretching toward her, and the walls seemed to close in inch by inch. She stepped back, the cold sweat gathering on her brow, but the room didn't let her go. The door was no longer where it had been, and the walls seemed to bend as though the house itself was rejecting her, trying to trap her within. For a moment, she was certain the room would consume her, swallow her whole. Panic rose in her throat, but she forced herself to move. Her body responded instinctively, her legs carrying her toward the door that had suddenly seemed so far away. The room resisted her, as if trying to keep her within its grasp, but Evelyn yanked open the door and stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath. Shaken, Evelyn's mind raced, but she pushed the fear aside. It must have been her imagination. The house was old and it was late. But even as she tried to convince herself that it was nothing, she couldn't escape the feeling that something had just crossed the line, that the manor wasn't simply an ancient home, but something much darker. Evelyn returned to her room, locking the door behind her. But the discomfort refused to leave her. The feeling that she was being watched, that she was not truly alone, lingered in the air like a suffocating fog. The next morning the house felt different. The light that filtered through the curtains was dimmer, and the air felt colder. Mr. Griffith had promised to be her guide, but when she went to find him, he was nowhere to be found. The staff seemed distant, their eyes avoiding hers as she passed. There was an odd tension in the air, a strange coldness that made her feel as though she was an outsider in her own home. As she turned a corner in the hallway, one of the staff members, a woman in a dark uniform, glanced at her with an unsettling look in her eyes. "You're here for the wrong reasons," the woman said, her voice low and almost accusatory. Evelyn froze, the words hanging in the air like a threat. What did she mean by that? It was a fleeting moment, but it left a heavy feeling in Evelyn's chest. She had no idea what the woman was implying, but one thing was certain. Evermore Manor was no ordinary place. Something was wrong, and the deeper Evelyn dug, the more she realized that the manor was watching her, controlling her every move. The question now was not if she was meant to be here, but why. The answers she had sought were slipping further from her reach, and Evelyn could no longer deny that the manor had its own plans for her. And for the first time she felt the true weight of what it meant to be chosen. The morning after her unsettling encounter with the hidden room, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that Evermore Manor was more than it appeared. The house seemed to breathe, shifting around her, aware of her every movement. With her curiosity gnawing at her, she ventured to the library, a cavernous, dimly lit room lined with towering bookshelves that seemed to stretch endlessly. The scent of old paper and leather filled the air, and the silence was almost oppressive, as though the books themselves held their breath, waiting for her to disturb them. She wandered through the aisles, trailing her fingers over the spines of the books, drawn to the dust-covered shelves in the far corner. It was there that she discovered the journal. Tucked behind a stack of forgotten tomes, the leather-bound book seemed oddly out of place, as if it had been waiting for her. The journal was old, the pages yellowed and fragile, but it was in surprisingly good condition. Evelyn sat in the nearest armchair, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. As she opened the journal, she was immediately struck by the neat, precise handwriting on the first page. Entries that seemed to document the life of Lady Celeste, the original owner of Evermore Manor. The ink was fresh, as though the author had written just yesterday, and the words detailed her experiences and emotions with haunting clarity. The entries began innocuously enough, describing Lady Celeste's childhood and her marriage to a mysterious nobleman who had long since disappeared from history. But as Evelyn read further, she felt a deep unease building. The passages began to grow more erratic, the tone shifting from joyful to fearful. Lady Celeste began speaking of strange occurrences within the manor, disembodied whispers, shadowy figures at the edge of her vision, and an oppressive, all-consuming feeling of being watched. The more Evelyn read, the more she understood. Lady Celeste had experienced the same sensations Evelyn now felt. The house was alive in some twisted, inexplicable way. But then, as she turned the page, something happened that made her freeze. The entry stopped abruptly. The last sentence was cut off mid-word, as if the writer had been interrupted. The page following it was entirely blank, an unsettling void where no words were written. Evelyn stared at it for a long time, waiting for her eyes to play tricks on her, but there was no mistaking it. The journal had stopped. Frustrated, she closed the journal and stood up, feeling a surge of disquiet flood her chest. She walked out of the library, but the unease only intensified. As Evelyn wandered back down the dark hallways, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the manor pressing in on her from all sides. The walls seemed to hum with energy, as though the house itself was alive. She tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to her like a second skin. When she returned to her room, her gaze fell instinctively on the journal, which lay innocuously on the small desk by the window. She hadn't left it open, nor had she touched it since her last encounter. Yet there it was, open, the pages turned as if someone had been reading it in her absence. Her pulse quickened as she stepped closer. As her fingers brushed the pages, she felt a chill run through her. The last entry she'd read was now completed. The words were written in a style that was markedly different from Lady Celeste's. Slanted, jagged, the ink darker and thicker. The handwriting was not hers. You shouldn't have come. The house knows you now. It will never let you leave. Evelyn recoiled, her breath caught in her throat. The handwriting felt like a cold touch on her skin. She turned the page in a panic, but there was nothing more. No answers, no explanations. Just an eerie blankness that only deepened her sense of being trapped. The journal had rewritten itself, and somehow, it was now a part of her reality. The manor was aware of her movements, of her very thoughts. The sensation of being watched returned with full force. The walls seemed to close in on her, and she quickly moved away from the desk, her heart pounding. But she couldn't shake the sense that the book was pulling her back in, beckoning her to delve deeper. As the hours passed, Evelyn found it harder to ignore the whispers that seemed to echo throughout the house. At first, they were soft murmurs at the edges of her hearing, indistinguishable from the creaks and groans of the old house settling. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, clearer. They came from nowhere, wrapping themselves around her, pulling her attention in every direction. She stood up from the desk and wandered out into the hallway, driven by an unknown force. The whispers followed her, growing in intensity as though they were speaking directly to her. Evelyn. Her name. Her name. Suddenly, the air in the hallway grew colder, and a strange pressure built in her chest. Evelyn's breath came out in short gasps as the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally around her, pulling at her from every angle. The whispers were deafening now, filling her mind, drowning her in a cacophony of voices. She stumbled forward, her mind reeling, until she found herself in front of a familiar door. The door to the room she had discovered earlier, the one with the scratched-out portrait. Before she could fully process what was happening, the door swung open of its own accord, as though the house had decided she was meant to enter. This time, when Evelyn stepped inside, everything was different. The room had transformed. The air felt alive, charged with a strange energy, and the familiar dimness of the room was now replaced by brilliant sunlight streaming in through the windows. The once dusty bookshelves were now pristine, and the old, worn furniture had been replaced with fine, rich decor. The walls were lined with fresh tapestries, their colors bright and vibrant. It was as if the room had been rewound, like it was now part of a distant, past time. Evelyn's gaze flicked to the window where she saw a woman standing, Lady Celeste. Her face was the same as in the portrait, and yet it seemed more real, more alive than the images in the journal. She was looking directly at Evelyn, her eyes wide with an intensity that made Evelyn's skin crawl. Then, as if sensing something, Lady Celeste began to disappear into the ether, her form fading as if it were made of mist. Before Evelyn could react, the scene around her started to warp and distort, shifting, bending, flickering like a broken film reel. And then, in the blink of an eye, the world around her shattered. Evelyn gasped for air, feeling as though she had been ripped from one reality and thrown into another. The whispers had stopped and the air was still again. She was back in the hallway, her body trembling, sweat dampening her brow. But nothing was the same. The manor felt different now, heavier, more foreboding. Her perception of time and space had been warped. She had seen the past, had touched it, and she realized with a sinking dread that she wasn't simply in a house. She was in the middle of something far darker, far older than she could have imagined. The manor was no longer just a physical space. It had power to bend time, to break reality, to hold her within its grasp. And Evelyn understood at last that she wasn't just visiting Evermore Manor, she was part of it now. She was trapped and there would be no escape. Evelyn awoke to the sound of footsteps. At first, she thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her, but as the days dragged on in Evermore Manor, the odd noises became more frequent. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps pacing in the halls, slow and deliberate. Other times, it was the faint echo of whispers coming from behind the thick, worn walls. Each time, Evelyn found herself frozen in place, unable to decide whether the sounds were real or just the twisted workings of her increasingly fragile mind. The oppressive atmosphere of the manor was slowly eroding her sanity. She had spent the past few days wandering the house in a haze of confusion, trying to make sense of the things she had seen and experienced. There was something profoundly wrong about Evermore Manor, something that went beyond mere superstition or ghost stories. It was as if the house itself was alive, manipulating time, space, and reality to ensnare her. And the longer she stayed, the harder it became to differentiate what was real and what was a product of the manor's dark, oppressive energy. In a desperate attempt to seek some clarity, Evelyn visited the manor's library again, hoping the journal might offer answers. The thick, heavy air in the room seemed to press against her as she stood before the shelves, her hands trembling. She had no idea how long she had been reading, but the hours bled together like a dream. The journal had stopped rewriting itself, but its presence still hung over her, its unfinished pages weighing on her thoughts. It was then that she found something strange, something that hadn't been there before. A small, folded piece of paper was tucked into the back of the journal. It was written in a hurried, jagged hand, as if the author had been pressed for time. There's someone still here. Someone who knows. Don't trust the house. Don't let it take you. Look for the one who stayed. They will show you what happens next. Evelyn's heart raced as she scanned the words. Someone who stayed. Someone who had never left the manor? She needed to know more. Determined to find this elusive guest, Evelyn combed the manor, her steps echoing eerily through the vast, empty hallways. She could feel the manor's eyes on her, the cold weight of its presence pressing down with every step. The house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for her to make a mistake. At last, in the back of the house, in a dark, almost forgotten wing, Evelyn found a door that seemed to resist her every attempt to open it. It creaked and groaned like a living thing when she pushed it open, revealing a room that felt utterly out of place. An old, dimly lit study filled with dusty books and the smell of mildew. There, in the far corner, sat a figure hunched over a table. The man was motionless, his body rigid as though frozen in time. His clothes were worn and frayed, his hair long and unkempt, as if he had been sitting there for years. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She had found him, the one who had never left. She approached cautiously, unsure what to expect. The man's eyes were wide open, staring blankly ahead, and his face was pale, almost waxen. But when Evelyn tried to speak to him, he didn't respond. There was no flicker of recognition, no acknowledgement of her presence. It was as if he were not truly there at all. Frustrated, Evelyn grabbed his arm and shook him gently. His body jerked in response, but his face remained still, unblinking. Suddenly, his hand twitched and began to move in jerky, uncoordinated motions, as though trying to communicate something. His fingers scratched at the table, creating frantic, chaotic lines in the dust. Evelyn watched, horrified, as he drew grotesque images, gruesome scenes of bloodshed, dismemberment, and shadowy figures standing over lifeless bodies. Evelyn recoiled. What was he trying to say? The man's hand trembled violently, and then, in a swift motion, he grabbed a nearby pencil and began to sketch something new. The image was haunting, an exact likeness of Evelyn standing in the same room, her eyes wide with terror. But there was one key difference. The Evelyn in the drawing had a vacant expression, her body frozen, her soul gone. The man's eyes met hers for the first time, and though his expression was blank, his lips trembled as if he was trying to speak. He didn't say a word, but his gaze spoke volumes. His eyes seemed to plead with her, a silent warning, as if begging her to understand. Evelyn's stomach churned as she looked at the drawings again. They showed her future, her own demise, trapped in this very manor, reduced to nothing more than a hollow shell. She was fated to become like him. Before Evelyn could comprehend the enormity of what she had seen, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the nearby candle and plunging them both into darkness. The man's body went rigid once more, his arm dropping limply to his side. He was once again lifeless, trapped in his own personal hell. Shaken to her core, Evelyn stumbled backward into the hallway. Her heart pounded in her chest as the weight of what she had just learned hit her. The manor was not just a place, it was a trap, a prison for those who entered, and once you were here there was no escape. She had seen the future, and it was a grim one. A future where she too would become a mere shell, unable to leave, forever part of the manor's darkness. In a desperate attempt to flee, Evelyn ran through the dark hallways, her mind racing. She needed to get out. She needed to find the door to freedom. But the moment she found what she thought was the exit, her stomach twisted with dread. The door opened to reveal the same room she had just left. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she stepped back, her mind refusing to accept what she was seeing. The furniture was unchanged, the walls exactly the same. The house had shifted. She was no longer in the hallway. The door she had opened was not a way out, it was a way back. The manor had reconfigured itself. Panicked, she sprinted in the opposite direction, only to find herself once again standing in front of the same door. It was the same twisted maze of hallways and rooms, constantly rearranging themselves, closing off her only means of escape. The house was alive, and it was playing with her. Her breath quickened, her pulse pounding in her ears. Evelyn realized with growing horror that she was not just trapped in Evermore Manor physically. The house was now controlling the very fabric of her reality, bending space and time to keep her inside its grasp. The layout was not fixed, it shifted with every step, every decision. The walls closed in on her and there was no way out. She was going to become like the man in the study. She would join the others who had been claimed by Evermore Manor, their spirits trapped, their fates sealed. But as the whispers swelled in her mind, Evelyn knew that the only way to survive was to confront the unseen force behind the manor's power, to face the darkness that had been waiting for her all along. And the house was waiting. Evelyn's heart thundered in her chest as she descended into the crypt beneath Evermore Manor, guided only by the flickering light of her lantern. The air was damp and cold, thick with the smell of earth and decay. She felt an unshakable sense of dread settle over her, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The manor had shifted again, rearranging its interior to lead her to this forsaken place. It was as though it had been waiting for her, expecting her to find the truth hidden in the shadows of its history. The crypt was older than the manor itself, its walls covered in centuries of dust and cobwebs. The stone floor was uneven, and the air had an almost suffocating weight to it, making it difficult for Evelyn to breathe. She had come to search for answers, anything that might explain the strange occurrences, the shifting walls, the haunting voices. But as she ventured deeper into the crypt, she began to sense that the answers she sought would come at a terrifying price. At the far end of the crypt, behind a rusted iron gate, she found a hidden passage. The gate creaked open with a force that echoed throughout the chamber, and as Evelyn stepped inside, she felt a shiver crawl down her spine. The passage led her to a vast underground chamber, dimly lit by the glow of ancient candles placed in alcoves along the walls. The ground was littered with debris, but at the center of the room, there stood a row of tombstones, ancient, weathered stones that looked as though they had been untouched for centuries. As she approached, Evelyn's breath hitched in her throat. Each tombstone was engraved with a name, but the dates on them were impossible. Some of the names were unfamiliar, others, hauntingly familiar. Her heart skipped a beat when her eyes landed on one tombstone, engraved with her own name, Evelyn Evermore. Her hands shook as she knelt down to examine it. The date on the tombstone read, October 30th, 2025. Her own death. The day she was meant to die. The realization hit her like a slap to the face. She had been drawn to the manor not by mere chance, but because of a fate that had already been written. Her bloodline, her name, had been part of this house's dark history for generations. Each of the tombstones had a final date, dates that didn't match the actual deaths of her ancestors, as if they had known their end was inevitable. The curse was not just some tale whispered in hushed tones by locals. It was real, and it was tied to her bloodline. Her existence had been woven into the very fabric of Evermore Manor. But that wasn't the most chilling part. At the far end of the row, there was a tombstone that sent a cold shiver through Evelyn's entire body. It was freshly carved, the stone still smooth and unweathered. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the name, Lady Celeste Evermore, her ancestor, the original matriarch of the cursed bloodline. And beneath the name was a date, October 30th, 2025, the same day as Evelyn's. The world around her seemed to warp and shift as Evelyn slowly stood, her head spinning. Her mind struggled to comprehend what she had just seen. The tombstones didn't lie, the manor knew her fate. And the curse didn't just extend to her. It had been passed down through generations, from ancestor to descendant, all the way back to Lady Celeste. As if on cue, the temperature in the crypt dropped. The flickering light of the lantern dimmed, and the shadows seemed to grow deeper, darker, more oppressive. Evelyn's pulse quickened as a cold, bone-chilling wind swept through the chamber. The whispers returned, louder now, like a cacophony of voices calling her name. Suddenly, the air thickened, and a shadowy figure appeared before her, Lady Celeste Evermore. The specter was translucent, her once regal appearance now faded and distorted by time. Her long, dark hair floated around her like a shroud, and her eyes were hollow, empty sockets. She gazed at Evelyn with a knowing, sorrowful look, as though the weight of centuries had settled on her spirit. "You should not have come," Lady Celeste's voice echoed through the crypt, low and mournful, as if it carried the sorrow of generations. "The manor has been waiting for you." Evelyn stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. "What is this? Why is this happening? Why me?" Lady Celeste's spirit extended a hand, her fingers trailing through the air like the whisper of a forgotten memory. "You are the heir, Evelyn. The true heir to this curse. The manor never wanted my bloodline to end. It needed you, needed your bloodline to carry the darkness forward." The words hit Evelyn like a blow to the chest. She had known something was off about her connection to the manor, but she had never imagined that it was so deep, so insidious. She had been brought here, chosen by the house itself. "The manor, it brought me here?" Evelyn whispered, the weight of the revelation suffocating her. Lady Celeste nodded. "The curse does not end with my death. It was never meant to. It seeks new blood, new heirs. I thought I could end it by leaving, by breaking the line, but I was wrong. It found you, my descendant, and it will continue even after you. I failed, and you will fail too." Evelyn's heart raced, her thoughts spinning wildly. "But there must be something I can do. I have to stop it. There has to be a way." Lady Celeste's face twisted in grief. "You can break the curse, yes. You can break it, but only for yourself. The manor will just find another heir. It will always find another." The truth slammed into Evelyn with full force. The manor wasn't simply a house. It was a malevolent entity, a force of darkness that devoured souls, trapping them within its walls for eternity. And it would continue its cycle, regardless of how many heirs died, until it had claimed them all. The whispers grew louder, as though the manor itself was mourning its lost prey. Lady Celeste's figure began to fade, her voice growing softer as the darkness closed in. You can't escape your fate, Evelyn. It's already written. The cold wind intensified, and with a final heart-wrenching look, Lady Celeste disappeared, leaving Evelyn alone in the crypt, her heart heavy with the weight of the curse. But Evelyn wasn't ready to give up yet. The manor had claimed so many, but it had never faced someone like her. If breaking the curse meant sacrificing herself, she would. But as Lady Celeste had warned, the manor would just find another. The cycle would never end. And Evelyn would never truly be free. Evelyn knew what had to be done. The crypt beneath Evermore Manor now felt like her own tomb, suffocating and cold. The grim words of Lady Celeste echoed relentlessly in her mind. The manor will just find another heir. Evelyn understood now the true horror of Evermore Manor's curse. It was a living parasite, feeding off her family's bloodline, ensuring its own survival through the endless torment of souls. But she would not surrender without fighting. She had discovered an ancient book in the library, buried beneath stacks of forgotten tomes. A book that described rituals, ceremonies, and dark rites powerful enough to break bonds forged by blood and darkness. Though the text was nearly illegible, Evelyn studied the symbols and chants meticulously, clinging to this slim chance at freedom. She chose a chamber at the heart of the manor, a circular room draped in dark velvet curtains, furnished only by a massive antique mirror that dominated one wall. Its gilded frame was intricately carved, yet tarnished and twisted as if touched by decay itself. Evelyn arranged candles in a circle, their flames flickering erratically, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Her hands trembled as she traced symbols in chalk upon the stone floor, reciting words of power in a voice that felt alien to her ears. The atmosphere thickened, charged with electricity, and the walls around her seemed to throb with anticipation. As Evelyn approached the mirror to mark it with the final symbol, she caught a glimpse of movement in its murky reflection. Her heart seized in terror. There was a figure there, behind her, dark, shifting, not quite human. She whipped around, breath quickening, but found herself staring at emptiness. The room was empty except for her. Yet, when Evelyn turned back to the mirror, she nearly screamed. The reflection staring back at her was a grotesque distortion of herself. Her eyes sunken, hollow sockets dripping with darkness, skin pale and peeling as if rotting away. The figure's twisted mouth opened slowly, emitting a guttural whisper, mocking her in her own distorted voice. "You are already ours." Evelyn gasped, stumbling back, but the twisted reflection remained, moving independently, its hands pressed against the glass as though begging for release. Horrified yet compelled, Evelyn stepped closer, drawn by an irresistible pull. As she stared into her grotesque double's eyes, she felt her own skin crawl and burn. Her hand rose involuntarily to her face and came away wet with blood. Her skin had begun to peel away, mirroring the horror in the glass, as if her reflection was actively pulling her into its corrupted reality. Evelyn jerked back in agony, breaking eye contact, desperate to reclaim control over her body. "No," she thought fiercely. "I won't let the manor win." Gathering her waning strength, Evelyn raised her voice, chanting the incantation louder, defying the house's attempts to consume her. She lit the final candle, completing the ritual circle. A rush of wind tore through the chamber, extinguishing half the candles and plunging the room into oppressive gloom. The mirror cracked loudly, splintering down its center. Evelyn felt a moment of triumph, but it was fleeting. From the darkness emerged shadows, figures coalescing from smoke and mist, the spirits of those who had come before. They filled the room, circling Evelyn, their spectral forms twisted in agony, faces frozen in eternal torment. In unison, their voices resonated like thunder through the chamber. "There is no escape, Evelyn. The ritual is meaningless. We have all tried and failed." Evelyn felt her body stiffen as the spirits rushed into her, invading her consciousness. Their memories overwhelmed her, centuries of pain, anguish, despair, each heir believing themselves different, each heir broken in the end. Evelyn's mind fractured under the weight of their collective grief. "You belong to the manor," they spoke again, voices echoing, each syllable punctuated by pain. "It claimed your mind the moment you stepped through its doors." Her thoughts splintered, and Evelyn screamed as the spirits tore through her, seizing control of her limbs. She was no longer alone within her own body. She was a vessel filled by countless victims of Evermore Manor, their presence clawing at her sanity. Through the chaos of her possessed mind, Evelyn saw glimpses of what the manor truly was, a monstrous entity feeding off despair, an eternal cycle of death and rebirth, hunger never sated. She finally understood that the curse could never be broken, only passed on, like a plague that would consume generation after generation. Defeated, her will crumbling, Evelyn fell to her knees, trapped within herself, drowning in the horrors of the countless souls who now held her captive. She was part of the manor, bound irrevocably to its darkness. Its grip tightened around her spirit, and she realized with crushing certainty that there was only one way forward. She would become like the others. Another whispering voice, another lost soul within Evermore Manor's walls. A part of her mind rebelled against the inevitable, fighting desperately for a glimmer of hope. Yet deep within her fractured consciousness, Evelyn knew that this was the price of freedom the manor demanded, the surrender of her very soul. And as the darkness enveloped her completely, Evelyn knew the manor's hunger would never be quenched. It would always thirst for more. She had been consumed. And Evermore Manor had won. Evelyn knelt, broken and gasping, at the center of the circle, the flames of the remaining candles flickering weakly around her. The spirits inside her mind had receded into a restless silence, leaving only a dark, oppressive emptiness. Every inch of her body screamed with exhaustion, yet she knew she had one final chance, one last desperate effort to defy the manor. She raised trembling hands toward the cracked mirror, whispering the ancient incantation, the words feeling alien as they left her lips. Her voice shook with desperation, each syllable carrying the weight of her shattered hope. As the chant reached its climax, she closed her eyes tightly, bracing herself for whatever fate awaited her. But something was wrong. Instead of dissipating, the energy surged violently, throwing Evelyn backward. Her spine slammed against the cold stone wall, the impact sending bursts of pain through her body. She opened her eyes to a horrifying sight. The walls of Evermore Manor were pulsating, alive with a grotesque rhythm. Wood warped and splintered, morphing into twisted, gnarled limbs. Wallpaper peeled away in thick strips, revealing a fleshy, pulsating mass beneath. The house was changing, transforming into something monstrous, something hungry. A sickening groan erupted from deep within the manor's foundation, echoing through the room, vibrating through her bones. Evelyn stumbled to her feet, but the floor beneath her buckled and shifted, twisting like living tissue. Her heart raced, panic seizing her chest. The manor had deceived her. Her ritual, intended to break the curse, had only made it stronger. Evermore Manor fed off her desperation, consuming her hope and fear, growing more powerful by the moment. Its sinister intent was clear now. It never meant to release her. It intended to absorb her completely. Suddenly, a dark force surged upward from the cracked mirror, filling the room with a thick, choking fog. Evelyn's skin burned as if touched by acid, and she felt the horrific presence of the manor itself invading her mind, tearing away the last threads of her sanity. "You are mine," the manor hissed, a distorted chorus of voices ringing through her skull. Evelyn fell to her knees again, helpless against the overwhelming force. The walls stretched inward, their grotesque limbs reaching for her, the entire manor becoming a monstrous mouth ready to swallow her whole. Her breaths were shallow, her vision blurred by tears of despair. But as the walls tightened their grip, a voice, cold and calm, broke through the chaos. "Enough." The manor froze, momentarily silenced. Evelyn lifted her head weakly, straining to see the source of the voice. Through the shifting shadows emerged a figure. A woman, tall and regal, draped in a cloak that seemed woven from darkness itself. Her eyes were piercing, unnaturally bright, shimmering with centuries of hidden knowledge. Who are you?" Evelyn gasped. The woman smiled coldly, stepping gracefully over the grotesque tendrils that had stopped moving at her command. "I am Seraphina Evermore," she replied, her voice resonating with power, authority, and chilling calmness. "The last true heir. And you, dear Evelyn, have served your purpose admirably." Evelyn's blood ran cold. "Served my purpose? You did this." Seraphina approached slowly, her eyes reflecting a dark amusement. "Of course. I've been watching you, guiding you from the shadows. Every whisper, every nightmare, every flicker in the mirror. It was always me, ensuring you reached this very moment." The manor seemed to recoil from Seraphina's presence, the twisted walls retreating slightly, bowing before her. The house recognized her authority. Evelyn stared, her heart hammering painfully. "But why?" Seraphina knelt before Evelyn, her expression softening, yet her gaze remained predatory. "Because your sacrifice has awakened what centuries of this manor's suffering could not. You've unleashed a force much older and more powerful than mere ghosts, a darkness sealed away by Celeste herself long ago. A darkness only your despair and sacrifice could awaken." Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps as she realized the terrible truth. "You used me to free something even worse." Seraphina nodded slowly. The manor feeds on suffering, yes, but it was never meant to exist without a ruler. You were a pawn, Evelyn, and now, thanks to you, the manor's true master returns. A deep, primal roar shook the manor, shaking Evelyn to her core. Behind Serafina, the mirror cracked completely, shards flying outward like glass rain, revealing a void of impenetrable darkness. From within it emerged something horrific, a dark entity formed of shadows and ancient nightmares, its presence bending reality itself. Serafina rose, her cloak billowing as she faced the monstrous entity. "Welcome home, my love." The creature responded with a sound that tore at Evelyn's sanity, recognition passing between them. It was the true evil behind Evermore Manor, sealed away for centuries, now returned, hungry and vengeful. Evelyn struggled weakly, her vision dimming, overwhelmed by the horror of her unintended betrayal. "Please, don't do this." Serafina looked down at Evelyn, pity mingling with disdain. "It's already done. Evermore Manor always wins." As Serafina extended her hand to the darkness, embracing the monstrous shadow, Evelyn felt the manor's presence surge within her again. Its tendrils enveloped her completely, pulling her into its core, binding her eternally to its horrors. Her last breath was stolen by the house, drawn from her lungs and absorbed into its endless hunger. Evelyn's body faded into shadow, her soul forever trapped within the manor's twisted heart. Evermore Manor had claimed her fully. The cycle was complete, and a greater darkness had been reborn. Evelyn's sacrifice had not ended the curse. It had unleashed something far worse, and now the world would suffer the manor's boundless, malevolent hunger. Evermore Manor shuddered violently, its grotesque walls convulsing and contorting in a final, nightmarish dance. Serafina stood calmly at the center of the chaos, watching with cold detachment as the ancient house tore itself apart from the inside out, revealing its rotten core. Outside, a violent storm raged, lightning illuminating the crumbling facade. The once majestic manor disintegrated under its own unbearable weight, collapsing into a vast sinkhole that tore open the earth with a deafening roar. Massive stones and timbers splintered like matchsticks, tumbling downward into darkness. Smoke and dust filled the night air, choking and thick, as the very foundation of Evermore Manor disappeared into the earth. But beneath the rubble, a new horror emerged. The chasm revealed a hidden labyrinth, a twisted network of catacombs spiraling deep beneath the manor's former site. Cold, pale moonlight seeped into the tunnels, illuminating passageways carved from ancient stone, stretching endlessly into darkness. At the heart of the labyrinth, a haunting tapestry of moments was revealed, repeating infinitely. Each corridor, each room, each crypt depicted familiar scenes from the manor's past. Guests arriving, drawn by greed or curiosity, invited by letters identical to Evelyn's own. Each guest was shown trapped, suffering, becoming lost souls within the manor's relentless grip. Evelyn's spirit, translucent and sorrowful, drifted helplessly among countless others, her visage locked in eternal despair. In every iteration she stood frozen, trapped in that final moment of hopeless realization, her eyes forever wide with anguish. The manor had always been a prison, but now it was clear that it was also a twisted museum of suffering, a timeless loop replaying each victim's torment. Every guest, every heir, believed they could break the curse, unaware that their fate was sealed the moment they accepted the manor's invitation. Serafina walked slowly through the corridors, her cloak whispering softly against the ancient stone. She observed the eternal cycle with quiet satisfaction. The dark entity released by Evelyn's sacrifice now flowed alongside her, a shadowy force radiating malevolence and power. "You see, my dear Evelyn," Serafina murmured, glancing briefly at Evelyn's tormented spirit, "this was always the manor's true purpose, to feed on the endless despair of those foolish enough to believe they could escape." Evelyn's ghostly form reached out in silent anguish, pleading wordlessly for release. But Serafina merely turned away, unmoved by the suffering she had orchestrated. At last, Serafina reached the center of the labyrinth, a chamber dominated by a massive obsidian mirror. The surface rippled and shifted constantly, reflecting not one but countless versions of the manor's past, present, and future. Her pale hand touched the glass gently, and the reflections twisted into a single scene. Evermore Manor, restored, awaiting its next victim. "It is time," she whispered, her eyes glittering with anticipation. Above ground, dawn broke over the ruins of Evermore Manor. Sunlight filtered gently through the misty remains, offering a deceptive calmness. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it an unnatural stillness. The grounds, seemingly peaceful once again, concealed the horrors beneath. A lone figure approached slowly up the winding path, a young man weary from his travels, clutching a familiar cream-colored invitation in his trembling hand. He paused, confused, staring at the open space where the manor should have stood. But as he blinked, reality shifted before him. In the blink of an eye, Evermore Manor reappeared, fully restored, its dark towers and ornate windows shining in the morning sun. His eyes widened in disbelief, but curiosity pushed him forward. The heavy front doors creaked open invitingly, and from within, soft whispers urged him to enter. He hesitated only briefly before stepping inside, sealing his fate. Far beneath the surface, Evelyn's spirit watched the mirror shift once more, witnessing this new arrival. She tried to scream, tried to warn him, but no sound emerged. Her suffering, her warnings, unheard, unseen, powerless. Seraphina's voice echoed softly through the catacombs. Another arrives, Evelyn. The cycle begins anew. It always does. As Evelyn drifted back into the shadows, her spirit fading into the endless nightmare, she finally understood the horrifying truth. Evermore Manor was eternal. Its hunger would never be sated. It thrived not on endings but on beginnings, each victim's fresh hope feeding the manor's ancient evil. Back at the surface, the heavy doors swung shut behind the young man with a definitive, haunting thud. The manor stood quietly, patiently, eagerly awaiting its next feast. The cycle had begun again. And as Evermore Manor took its next breath, the whispers resumed, growing louder, deeper, until they filled every corner, every crevice, echoing endlessly. Welcome home.